You might remember in the late 90s that the Sistine Chapel was treated. Centuries of dirt and grime were cleaned away from Michelangelo's famous fresco paintings, allowing visitors to have an experience closer to what they would have had when they were freshly painted in the early 1600s. A lot brighter. More recently, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was repaired and cleaned following a devastating fire. The work on both those projects is called conservation, which is the treatment of objects to restore them as closely as possible to their original condition. I don't know about you, but the thought of taking a paintbrush and touching up a masterpiece kind of freaks me out. Who are the people with the nerves of steel to do this? Well, you're about to meet one, and he has fascinating stories to tell. Welcome to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, where we take you beyond just the art on the walls and into the stories of the artist and the ideas behind them. I'm your host, Kathleen Layton. Scott Heffley worked as a painting conservator at the Nelson-Atkins for 34 years. During that time, he was up close and personal with more than 100 of the museum's paintings, many of them masterpieces. But besides being a world-class conservator, Scott is also an avid collector in his spare time, which he has more of since retiring a few years ago. His home is a Disneyland of treasures, such as prehistoric Indian pots, marble statues, Murano glass chandeliers, vintage radios. He even has a collection of colorful resin grape clusters festively spilling out from a bay window. It's really a magical place. Thanks so much for joining us, Scott, and taking us through the fascinating world of conservation and also your years of collecting. Now, you actually have a degree in chemical engineering. How did that path lead to painting conservation?
Well, actually, that question can be answered best by starting in high school. You know, you're a student, your grades are good, you don't quite know what you want to do. And I was talking to a guidance counselor, and he brought up the idea of chemical engineering. I said, sure, that sounds good. And I like chemistry quite a bit. Got into Bucknell University, and in engineering, you know, they require you to take exact classes that they suggest, and there's no room for free electives until my last year, my fourth year. And I wanted to do something totally different, so I took portrait sculpture with clay, just to squeeze clay and just get out of engineering for a little bit. And I loved it. You know, I really just loved creating, and I wasn't half bad at it. So I schemed away at something that they have at Bucknell, which is a 5-year engineering program, giving you a BS in engineering and a BA in something else. So I did that with studio art. Then working for Mobil Oil as a research chemical engineer after graduation, I was taking evening classes at the Pennsylvania Academy painting portraits just to keep up with the art. And that's where I found out about the field of conservation and applied to the graduate school. And there are only 3 that take about less than 30 students a year for all the fields of conservation.
Wow.
And got in, and that's that part of the history.
So somebody in art conservation has to have a grasp of science, of course, but also a strong knowledge of art history, but also has artistic talent. That seems like a unicorn to me.
Well, it's true. You do need to have high quality in all 3 of those areas. You know, you're working with art historians, so you have to be on the same level, talking about the history of the art and the aesthetics that you're observing. The chemical sciences, the deterioration of artwork is a chemical process. And a lot of what we do is trying to slow down deterioration or arrest it. And so the understanding of the chemical sciences is very important. But then studio art, you have to be able to match colors. You have to really understand the aesthetics of a work of art so that you can knit back damages that have happened in the past.
It sounds like it's a crowded field of people that are trying to get in, or is it pretty slim?
Well, no, it's a crowded field of people trying to get in. As I mentioned, 3 major schools that teach it, 2 taking 10 students a year and 1 taking less than that, NYU. And there'll be over 100 applications for those 10 spots. And this is in graduate school for conservation. And anymore, to work in a museum, you really do have to have that degree and background to get in to work in a museum, these masterpieces.
And does every museum have a conservation department or somebody working on the art right in that museum?
No, they don't. I mean, to support a conservation department, it's expensive. And, museums are nonprofits, and smaller museums don't have that kind of money or space. So the larger museums might have conservation facilities. And then there are also regional centers, which are collection of conservators working for smaller institutions or private people, and they're located in different places around the country.
So let's talk about what is the purpose of conservation?
Well, good question. You could break that down into two major areas. One is preservation. We use our scientific background and our understanding of artwork to help preserve it. As I mentioned, all of these deterioration processes are chemical processes, and so we look to intervene in the museum environment to slow these things down. We keep the light levels appropriate for the work of art. We keep the relative humidity at the right level so that things don't deteriorate. When things travel, we're very careful about if we even allow it to travel, if it can travel, and then the packing of it is advised by conservation and the packing department. So that's a big part of it. But then the other part is restoration, where, in my case, paintings, paintings are hundreds of years old often, and they've been owned by different people. They've perhaps been through wars. They've gone here and there, and things have happened to them, and they've deteriorated in some measure.
Each painting tells a story, doesn't it?
Each painting tells a story, and you don't get to hear all of the story. You do what you can to understand what's going on with the painting. So the second half is restoration, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into the podcast a bit.
So what is it like to actually use solvents and scalpels on masterpieces during the restoration process? Isn't that scary?
Well, the answer to that is you're not scared. Your senses are heightened. Your focus is absolutely sharp as can be, but you're not scared. You could ask a doctor, a surgeon, the same question. Aren't you scared operating on someone's heart? And the answer is, you don't want them to be scared. You don't want me to be scared working on an El Greco, and I'm not. But boy, there's an intensity to my focus when I am working on them.
I've seen that focus.
Yeah,
it's like a laser.
Well, it's funny. I've seen photos of myself examining a painting. I'm not paying attention to the camera, and there is an intensity to my face that I don't even recognize. But it's me looking at the artwork and trying to see whatever I can see about its condition.
Also, your years in the business help you to be confident.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
There's so much work and study involved before you ever even touch a painting. You look at it in 3 dimensions using X-rays, other technologies. What are you looking for, and what kinds of technologies are available to you?
Right. So the first step in any kind of restoration process is a very thorough examination. We really study the painting inside and out to understand what the artist left behind, what history of bad conditions or environmental problems have caused to the painting, and we really assess its current condition and what we think we can do to help improve its condition.
Do you study the artist as well?
We study the artist. We work with the curator, the art historian. When I would travel to other museums in other countries, I'd always focus on their collections, often planning a restoration that's coming up, and looking at paintings by that artist ahead of time. But you ask about how we study and examine. We can take X-rays. We use infrared light to identify certain features. We can take paint cross-sections, tiny little chips of paint that are embedded in a plastic and turned on edge so that we polish that edge, and we can look at the layers of paint with a microscope. We use binocular microscopes so that we see in 3 dimensions when we're looking at the surface of a painting. And we may call in scientific experts or art historical experts to help us with a particular work before we even begin. So all of this is before we use any solvents or scalpels or any touch to the painting.
So you're looking for any changes that might have been undergone through the history of this painting, mm-hmm. and figuring out what the artist actually intended on that canvas?
The answer is yes, but what's left is what's left. And you assess that very carefully before you begin. And then once that's finished, you write a thorough report articulating all that you learned in the examination, and you add a proposed treatment, what you would like to do to address its issues once you've identified them. And the curator and often the director will look over the report and sign it and agree that this is the right approach. And then, as I work on the painting, the curator will be involved in just coming up now and then and being on board with everything that's happening with the work.
One of the projects in your career was Rembrandt's Portrait of a Young Man. And that actually began because the painting was requested for loan.
Right.
Is that how you usually start looking at a painting? Somebody wants to borrow it and you take a look at it and say, wait a minute, we might want to do some zhuzhing.
Sometimes, yeah, that can be the way that our priorities are determined. But and also the curators and even the director might have certain projects in mind. And we, the conservators, will say, look, this painting could look a whole lot better, and then work with the curator, and it may move up in the priority list. The Rembrandt was requested for loan, and it's not a painting that I loved a lot. A great Rembrandt. It's a late Rembrandt, 3 years before his passing. It's a bright young man, and it was requested for loan. So that began the examination process. In studying it, I found a lot of strange things that were a little hard to explain. There was a strip of canvas added to the top of the painting. 3.5 inches of painting was added at the top. And Rembrandt sometimes did that when he was painting something and he found that he needed to expand the picture plane. He sometimes, not often, added a piece of canvas to make it bigger. So it could have been him. But then in further examination, I found, when a painting is on its original stretcher, humidity changes cause it to move and change and so on. And sometimes the inner edge of that stretcher will create a crack in the paint. And there'll be just a little ridge around the inner edge of the stretcher in those early years when the painting is on that stretcher. I found those cracks on the Rembrandt, and from them I was able to determine that the 2 edges were the original edges, nothing had been lost, and the top, the 3.5 inches was not supposed to be there, but there was an inch of Rembrandt that was lost. So working with Roger Ward, the curator of European painting at that time, we all came to the same agreement that we should change the format of this painting. So we planned to make a new frame to cover 2.5 inches of the top strip edition and then show the painting in its original size. That meant that I had to in-paint an inch of the top strip to match Rembrandt because that had to show. That was part of his composition.
You had to become Rembrandt.
Well, I did. Yeah. It's funny. And I had a long scheduled vacation, and it was coming up close to the loan date on this painting. And Roger, the curator, was very polite, but he said, are you sure you can go away for a week and, when you have to finish this? And I said, oh, yeah, I feel comfortable with that. And he let me go, and I finished it okay, and all turned out well.
How long did that whole process take?
Well, I can't remember exactly, but it was numerous months for sure. And that's another question you might ask. Sometimes these projects don't take long if they're straightforward, but sometimes they can take many months. When I worked on our two El Grecos at different times, the Trinitarian Friar, the late El Greco, back maybe 200 years ago, 250 years ago, someone overpainted the background with oil paint, which is the same as the original paint. Anyway, long story, I ended up having to use a microscope and scratch that off very carefully day after day. And that took over a year. A little over a year. But now, at the same time, I'm examining loans, I'm, checking humidities, I'm doing all the other stuff that's involved in conservation. But it took a full year of restoration time.
How long would you spend per day? Say, if you've got to scratch that whole background and it took over a year, you can't do that for 8 hours. I mean, you would be...
Yeah, basket
your
case.
body would not allow that,
Right,
I don't think.
Right.
So
Well, and that's true.
how do you decide? Do you say, I'm going to do this for an hour, and then I'm going to go do some other things, and then I'm going to come back to it? How do you do that?
I don't decide. I just work on it until I need to take a break. But it's funny, something like that, you kind of get lost in it. It's kind of enthralling. You have to be incredibly careful with that scalpel under the microscope, and your senses are on edge, and that tires you out. But it's also invigorating for me. And while I'm doing a repeated task like that, my mind can wander, and I can think of other things. And even though a day's work might reveal a half an inch square, it's progress. And as the weeks and months moved on, I was seeing progress, and that was rewarding. And the painting turned out wonderfully. It's on the gallery wall now, and it's very well regarded as a very important late El Greco.
Do you like it better now?
Oh, absolutely. My gosh. Yeah, way better.
You're almost like a detective, because you're seeing the history of this painting throughout many, many years as you are examining it.
Well, it is detective work, and it's scientific examination. You're also thinking about art history and how the artist worked. You'll read about how the artist worked if there's information on that. Some artists didn't want varnish on their paintings, and maybe they wrote about that. And so you work with the curator or do your own research and try to learn as much about an artist's technique as you can. But that's part of the detective work. But then the physical examination and your own senses and experience helps inform that detective work and leads you to your best results in the process.
Is there a project that was incredibly difficult for you and seemed insurmountable as you approached it, but then you finally got through it?
Well, good question. No projects have seemed insurmountable. I don't know what that means, but I felt fine about all the projects. Now, there were hard projects and real challenging ones. The El Greco Trinitarian Friar with the scratching off of the overpaint was quite a challenge. And somebody realized there was overpaint and did a solvent test cleaning, and they went straight through the oil paint they wanted to remove, but all the way through the original two, right down to the ground. And so
you have to disentangle oil paint from hundreds of years ago.
But with the microscope, once I came to understand the different layers and could see them more clearly, and this took time, I could see it very clearly, and that informed, the work on it. And the other El Greco, the Penitent Magdalene, was a real challenge as well. Both of these works were restored in preparation for El Greco's 400th anniversary of his birth, and both were featured in Toledo, Spain, where he worked his longest period. And both were, key works in their exhibitions on El Greco. And here we are in Kansas City with two super great El Grecos.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We're so lucky.
Pretty lucky.
So let's talk a little bit about your collecting. I have visited your home. It is a wonderland of objects. You have an African-American quilt collection, folk art, sparkling Mexican jewelry. You also have a lucite toilet seat embedded with coins and dollar bills. How have you started these collections?
Well, thanks. And it was fun having you over and showing you some of the stuff. As a kid, collectors start when they're kids, and I collected rocks and then maybe bottle caps. I think I remember that for a while. And I didn't really get into stamps, but then my parents would stop at antique malls when we were going on vacation, and that sort of opened my eyes a little bit.
Planted the seed.
And it just sort of grew and took off into a crazy wild jungle at that house.
You travel the world and you're always on the lookout for these treasures. What is it you're looking for?
Well, I mean, when I travel the world, either for the museum or on my own, I'm always looking for things like anyone. But, here in Kansas City, or when I travel the States, go to antique malls or flea markets and just sort of turn over the rocks and see what falls out. It's thrilling to go to an antique show or antique mall and just poke around. I mean, most of the stuff is uninteresting, but you'll find something that really catches your fancy. And it's amazing that we can acquire these things that are handmade by such talented people. You can go to an antique market and buy a quilt that took hundreds of hours perhaps to make and afford to buy it. And then, surround yourself with these artifacts and just learn from them all the time. I just really love it. When COVID hit, of course, that was bad for everyone, and you're stuck in your house all the time. And I have a lot of friends in that house, and I was messing around with my antiques and fixing them up and just arranging them or putting them in order, all of that.
What catches your eye? What causes you to take out your bank card and say, this is an object I want, because your collection is so unique? It encapsulates so many different cultures and periods of time.
Well, I can't articulate what would cause me to decide to buy something. It just tells me, the price is right, the quality is there, it's rare enough, or not so rare, but it fits in. The artifact will sort of just come up with its answer. Whether
it speaks to you.
It speaks to me. And, it has to be a price I can afford. And, the trouble is, I don't think about where I'm going to put this stuff. I buy, if it's the right thing.
Clearly, I've been to your home.
Yeah, I know it. Luckily it's a big house, and I'm pretty good at stacking things in closets. No, it's just so much fun. I walk around in the house and really am astonished that I can own and have around me things made by other artisans and quality of craftsmanship, and have it all right there in my house to look at and restore
and
as
to
I
live
want
with.
to, and to live with. Right.
Has your career as a conservator informed your collecting?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say both ways. In both cases, you're really examining things. You're really looking at artifacts. In conservation, you're thinking about how to preserve it and perhaps restore it. But in collecting, You decide whether you want to have it in your house, you want to spend time with it, if it fits in with other things that you've collected. So it's in both cases you're really scrutinizing the objects, and so that ability or interest in really looking at things closely feeds both sides of that coin.
Is there something you are looking for that you have not yet been able to find?
Well, the answer to that is I don't know what that would be, but I'll know it when I find it, and then maybe 2 weeks later I'll find something even better. No, there's not anything that I'm just trying to find. It really is based on the objects themselves and how they catch my interest and how they relate to what I already have. And when I get something new, it often sits in the living room for a while, so I can sit there with my green tea and just look at it in the morning, and then it probably needs something to be cleaned off of it or fixed up a little bit, touched up, and I'll do that. So retirement is more conservation, more collecting, not working on Rembrandts, but maybe little treasures of my own.
I wish you many more years of taking care of and acquiring those treasures.
Well, thanks, for sure.
Thank you, Scott, for talking to us today about conservation and your collection.
Great. Well, thank you.
Really fun. We've been listening to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. I'm Kathleen Layton. We'll see you next time.